Hi everyone, I'm Clara. I am Teresa, and we are both first-year undergraduate neuroscience students at UCLA. And today, as was said before, we will be presenting on the evaluation of sex differences in amygdala-hippocampus connectivity in autism spectrum disorder. So autism spectrum disorder is a neurological and developmental disorder that's characterized by deficits in social interactions and communications, as well as restrictive or repetitive behaviors, both of which can cause significant impairments in other areas of functioning. And one of the diagnostic criteria is that symptoms need to be present during the early developmental period, which is why ASD is most often diagnosed during childhood. And we chose to look at the amygdala-hippocampus connectivity because these brain regions are responsible for emotional processing and the consolidation of memories, which are both associated with behaviors like social camouflaging and the internalization of emotions. And there are some disparities in the diagnosis of ASD between males and females. It's most often cited that the male to female ratio of ASD diagnoses is 4-1, but recent research actually suggests that this ratio is a lot more balanced, with a study in 2022 even suggesting that it's closer to 3-4. And this is because ASD is systemically underdiagnosed in females, since females have historically been underrepresented in ASD research. And even though it's been clinically observed that the symptoms of ASD differ between males and females, from sensory sensitivities to emotional regulation, the diagnostic criteria in the DSM is primarily based on the presentation of ASD in males. So as was previously mentioned, ASD in females is not only historically underdiagnosed, with about 80% of females with ASD not properly diagnosed by the age of 18, but its consequences are also detrimental. A study done in 2023 found that the late diagnosis of ASD is associated with both poor mental and physical health. Some examples being higher rates of depression, sleeping disorders, and also offending behaviors, most primarily substance abuse. So as a result, we felt that more research needed to be done to understand these sex differences in order to make diagnostic protocols more accurate. And so our objective is to explore one of the observed sex differences in ASD in emotional processing and internalization. It has been discovered that females with ASD tend to experience more severe emotional dysregulation, and this can increase their risk for other psychiatric comorbidities as shown in the chart. And to study this, we wanted to measure the differences in amygdala-hippocampus connectivity between males and females with ASD to try and identify the neural mechanisms that may underlie the differences in social behavior. So with the time and resources that we had, the best preliminary research that we felt that we could do was through a secondary data analysis. So we took the pre-processed data from the ABIDE dataset, which stands for the Autism Brain Imaging Data Exchange dataset, and we downloaded the resting state fMRI data from the NYU Medical School. And we only sampled about 40 of the participants because there was a big limitation in that there were only 10 females with ASD present in the entire sample, which is an exhibit of what we previously mentioned, with females with ASD being historically underrepresented in research, and hence why our research is so important. In downloading this data, we downloaded it with the Harvard-Oxford Atlas, with the data being time series data split into 111 regions of interest. In regard to how we gathered and organized our data, we calculated the Pearson correlation coefficient between the regions number 5 and number 6, which correlate to the left amygdala and left hippocampus. And we have some graphs up on our presentation that show a functional connectivity matrix for one of the participants, and it looks like about 0.4 connectivity. And in the graph on the bottom, that's kind of how our spread of data looked like after we organized it. And so since our sample size is relatively small and the distribution of data was non-normal, we decided to run a non-parametric test called ART-ANOVA to measure the effects and interactions of sex and diagnosis on functional connectivity. And we found that the diagnosis of ASD does have a significant effect on amygdala-hippocampus functional connectivity. However, the interaction between sex and ASD diagnosis, which is measured by the differences in amygdala-hippocampus functional connectivity in males and females with ASD relative to their respective control groups, was not significant. And even though this finding was not significant, we did see that our data seemed to be sex sensitive. So we ran a Mann-Whitney U-test to do more specific pairwise group comparisons. And interestingly enough, there was very little difference between the functional connectivities of ASD males in the control male group, but there was a significant difference between the ASD females and the control female groups with a moderate effect size as well. And this likely reflects how females with ASD tend to internalize their emotions more and experience more social camouflaging, which is not common in males with ASD.
So we wanted to end off our presentation by talking a little bit about the clinical applications of our research. First and foremost, we would like everyone to be more mindful about the stereotypes that have historically been associated with ASD. We believe that it would be beneficial for everyone, not just physicians and scientists, to be more attentive towards the occurrence of ASD in females and be more attentive towards their symptoms. In regard to diagnosis, we do believe that some adjustments could be made to the DSM-5. As was previously mentioned, there are two main symptoms on the DSM-5 that both have to be apparent for a diagnosis to occur. The first being social deficits, and the second being repetitive behaviors like repetitive motor behaviors and also repetitive interests. However, both of those are very external symptoms, so we do believe, based off our research, because the internalization of emotion does seem to be sex-sensitive and could be more apparent in females with ASD, the DSM-5 could do better by incorporating more attention to internalized symptoms, such as depressive, anxious symptoms, and pay more attention to isolation rather than tantrums or outbursts. Likewise, we believe that the testing for ASD could also be adjusted likewise, and we've provided some examples of pre-existing assessments that could be used as inspiration in order to change current diagnostic protocols.
And these were the sources that we referenced to, and thank you for listening.
All right, great work from Clara and Teresa. Does anyone from our audience have any questions for our presenters?
Hi, brilliant presentation. Are you aware of what mechanisms or processes are in existence to improve the scope of early diagnosis? Because you mentioned that so many people are undiagnosed. What's being done to improve that condition?
So currently, a lot of the diagnostic protocol is based on the DSM. So it's based on a lot of behavioral assessments where parents are noticing that their child is experiencing these outbursts and tantrums. They'll bring them into a physician for testing. So that's why we wanted to study this, is to bring more awareness as to the presentation of ASD symptoms in females, because oftentimes in females with ASD, the symptoms are a lot more internalized, where they've learned to camouflage their symptoms, so it's not as obvious to the outward perspective.
Any other questions from our audience? All right, great job. All right, so our next group of presenters are going to be Jeshan Satwick with you and Vihan, and they're going to be talking about the gut-brain axis and its relation to Alzheimer's disease.